They never feared your darkness, they feared your light. Not the wounded parts of you that stayed silent in rooms, but the rising parts that dared to speak without trembling. You see, it was never about you being too much. It was about them being too little in your presence. Because when you stopped apologizing for your truth, they felt exposed. When you walked into the room without needing permission, their masks began to slip. They called you intense, difficult, too deep. But what they really meant was this: you made them see themselves, and they weren't ready for that kind of mirror. You didn't fit into their small expectations, and that made you dangerous, not because you tried to destroy anything, but because your existence alone reminded them of everything they had buried. You didn't need to attack. You only needed to be real, and in a world built on illusion, that is the most terrifying thing you can ever be. You weren't confused, you were just surrounded by people who wanted you small. They told you that you were confused, lost, too emotional, too intense, didn't they? They wanted you to question your instincts, second guess your clarity, and shrink from your own voice. But let me tell you something no one ever dared to say out loud. You were never confused. You were awake in a world that profits from people staying asleep. You were clear in an environment where clarity was inconvenient. It wasn't your truth that was the problem. It was how loudly it echoed in their silence. From the very beginning, they saw in you a mind that refused to be tamed and a soul that refused to wear a leash. And instead of celebrating it, they tried to smother it. Not because you were wrong, but because you reminded them of the truth they had spent their lives avoiding. You see, people who live in cages hate the sound of wings. People who settle for less will always feel threatened by someone who expects more, not from others, but from themselves. And you carried that expectation like a torch in the night. You didn't demand attention, you demanded authenticity. And that terrified them more than you'll ever know. Because when someone like you walks into the room, it shifts the atmosphere. Suddenly, small talk feels hollow. Pretending gets exhausting. And all the games they mastered for years no longer work. That's what you did to them. Without even trying, you reminded them of what it means to live without masks. But they didn't call it that. No, they gave it names to make it sound like your fault. Too much, too sensitive. Overthinking. They used words like knives not to cut you open, but to make you sew yourself shut. They hoped you'd dim your own fire, so they wouldn't feel cold in their own shadows. But here's the truth. You weren't lost. You were outgrowing the space they needed you to stay in. They needed you unsure, hesitant, apologetic, because that version of you didn't challenge them. That version of you was safe, predictable, and easy to manipulate. But the real you, the one that started asking deeper questions, the one that refused to settle, the one that stopped explaining themselves just to be tolerated. That version of you was a threat, not because you harmed anyone, but because your freedom made them realize how trapped they truly were. And deep down you always knew that unease you felt around them wasn't paranoia. It was your spirit recognizing a cage. That ache in your chest after talking to them wasn't weakness. It was wisdom knocking, begging you to listen. You weren't hard to love. You were just inconvenient to control. That's why they pushed back. That's why they labeled you. That's why they needed you small. Because if you ever stood tall in the full truth of who you are, they would have no choice but to confront the lies they've built their lives on. But you're not here to be small. You're not here to be liked by those who benefit from your silence. You are here to be whole, to be honest, and to take up the space that is rightfully yours. Not with arrogance, but with unapologetic presence. And if that makes others uncomfortable, so be it. Let them feel it. Let them sit in the echo of your truth, because you were never confused. You were simply the only one brave enough to see the world, and yourself, as they truly are. Your presence silenced their performances. You never had to raise your voice. You never had to expose them. All you had to do was walk into the room and be real. And suddenly the entire stage they built collapsed, because your presence didn't just enter quietly. It revealed the lies, the performances, the subtle manipulations they used to control the atmosphere. None of it could survive around you. You didn't speak loudly, but your silence echoed. You didn't attack, but your eyes told the truth. And that alone was enough to make the performers shake behind their carefully constructed roles. Because when someone shows up in full authenticity, those who rely on illusions start to panic. They smiled too wide, laughed too loud, spoke with too much certainty, hoping to drown out the discomfort you stirred in them. You were the unexpected pause in their scripted performance. You didn't expose them with insults or confrontation. You exposed them with your calm refusal to play along. You didn't engage in the gossip, the posturing, the power games, and that silence, that sacred disinterest. It unraveled them because their confidence wasn't real. It was performance art, and your existence was a critic they never invited. You see, people who wear masks don't fear confrontation. They fear reflection, and you reflected something they couldn't imitate. Integrity. You carried stillness while they performed noise. You carried depth while they skimmed surfaces. They wore their confidence like a costume, but yours came from the wounds you survived without bitterness. They spoke of power, but you had something stronger, peace, and peace cannot be faked. It cannot be borrowed. It is earned through fire and silence, and walking away from places that begged you to betray yourself just to be included. And still, they couldn't name it. They didn't know why they felt uneasy around you. They called it arrogance, coldness, distance. But deep down, they knew. It was never that you looked down on them. It was that you saw through them. You saw what they were trying to be. You saw what they were hiding. And your very presence whispered the one thing they were terrified to hear. You don't have to pretend with me. But they weren't ready for that kind of freedom. They were addicted to the performance. So they feared you because you made the stage feel false. And you wondered why they distanced themselves. Why the conversations grew awkward. Why they laughed harder when you spoke softer. It's because you broke the rhythm of their charade. You reminded them of truth in a world that celebrates disguise. You made them feel exposed, not because you demanded anything, but because you required nothing. And people who crave attention often feel starved in the presence of someone who is whole without applause. But don't let that make you shrink. Don't mistake their discomfort for your flaw. You are not too intense. You are not too still. You are not too anything. You are simply not acting. And in a world of performers, authenticity is not just rare, it is threatening. So let them talk. Let them misunderstand you. Let them rewrite the script to cast you as the villain. Because the truth is, you were never part of their play. You were the reminder that life begins the moment we stop performing. And whether they admit it or not, they felt that. Every time you walked into the room, they couldn't understand you because you weren't trying to be understood. You didn't ask for attention. You didn't beg to be seen. You didn't stand there performing your pain for applause or your strength for validation. That alone made you a mystery, not because you were complicated, but because they were used to people explaining themselves, shrinking themselves, needing to be liked just to feel worthy. But you didn't need that. You were quiet in the places they were loud. You were calm where they sought chaos, and that terrified them, because when someone doesn't chase understanding, they become hard to label. And when someone doesn't fit inside a label, they become hard to control. That's what you were to them, uncontrollable, not because you were wild, but because you were whole. They said you were distant. They said you were cold. But what they didn't understand was that you had already found warmth inside yourself. You didn't need the room to see you. You had already looked yourself in the eye and made peace with what you saw. You didn't decorate your wounds for sympathy. You carried them like medals. You didn't advertise your battles. You won them in silence, and that silence, it confused them, because they couldn't figure out what you wanted. They couldn't figure out who you were trying to impress, and the truth was, no one. That was the danger, that was the power, because the moment you stop needing to be understood, you stop being manipulatable. You don't bend to opinion, you don't shift for acceptance, you don't trade your truth for comfort, You simply are, and in a world that's obsessed with appearance, image, and approval, being unapologetically yourself is almost too much for most people to handle. It's not that they hated you, it's that they didn't know what to do with you. You didn't play the roles they had rehearsed for. You didn't respond to their guilt trips, their passive aggression, their silent punishments. You didn't fold like they expected, and that kind of freedom, it's confronting, because your presence made them ask questions they weren't ready to answer. Questions like, why am I so uncomfortable around someone who is at peace with themselves? Why do I feel inferior around someone who isn't even competing? They didn't say these things out loud, but they felt them, and that feeling turned into fear, not of you, but of what you represented, because you weren't trying to be understood. And suddenly, they had to face the truth that maybe they didn't even understand themselves, and still, you kept walking. You didn't stop to explain why you were different. You didn't dilute yourself to make others more comfortable, because you knew something they didn't, that some people will never understand you, and that's okay. Your job was never to make them see you. Your job was to see yourself clearly enough that their misunderstanding could never make you doubt your reflection again. So when they labeled you, let them. When they backed away, let them. When they misunderstood your silence, your strength, your peace, let them. That was never your battle to fight. Your battle was always internal. And you won it. You stood in the fire of rejection, of judgment, of isolation, and didn't burn. You didn't collapse. You didn't seek approval in places that drained you. You chose something greater than being understood. You chose to be whole. And in the end, that's why they feared you, because no one can truly understand someone who doesn't need to be explained. You refused to bow where others crawled. There is something unsettling about a person who won't kneel to what the world worships. And you were that person. You didn't bow where others crawled. You didn't chase status. You didn't play politics. You didn't twist your voice into something softer just to be tolerated in rooms that never deserved your truth. That made you dangerous, not because you fought loudly, but because you refused to kneel quietly. You walked away when others begged to belong. You said no when silence would have earned you favor. You kept your dignity when compromise would have made things easier. And in doing so, you disturbed the comfort of those who had long sold their integrity for applause, position, and approval. They watched you with confusion. How could someone walk away from power, from opportunity, from belonging? They couldn't grasp it because they had never stood still long enough to hear their own soul speak. You did, and it told you not everything that glitters is gold, and not every invitation is a compliment. You saw what others didn't want to see, that bending to be accepted comes at the cost of your backbone, and no matter how tempting the prize, you weren't willing to pay that price. You valued your peace too deeply. You cherished your truth too much. You understood that when you crawl to keep people close, you end up losing yourself in the process. And so, you chose the harder path. You chose silence over approval. You chose solitude over false connection. You chose boundaries over begging, and they hated you for it, not because you harmed them, but because your refusal exposed their compliance. Your defiance whispered what they had tried to forget, that freedom is possible. But it demands courage. It demands standing tall when the world wants you on your knees. And courage, real courage, is rare. You weren't rebellious. You were resolved. You weren't difficult. You were discerning. You weren't angry. You were awake. And people who are truly awake will always unsettle those who are still performing sleep. So they pushed you out, called you cold, accused you of pride, but deep down they knew. You weren't proud. You were principled. You weren't cold. You were clear. You weren't distant. You were done playing games where the rules require you to abandon yourself. And what they couldn't stand, what they'll never say out loud, is that deep down they admired you. Because every time you said no to something they settled for, it reminded them they could have chosen differently. Every time you walked away with your spine intact, it made them question the rooms they had crawled to remain in. You weren't there to expose them, you were simply there to live free. But in a world that feeds on compromise, freedom is a threat. So when they turned on you, let them. When they said you were difficult to work with, hard to love, impossible to understand, let them. They were never speaking about you. They were speaking about the parts of themselves they abandoned long ago. You didn't make them feel small. You made them remember what it felt like to stand tall. And if that's what makes you feared, then so be it. Let your spine remain straight, even when the world demands you bow. Because in the end, those who crawl will never understand the strength it takes to walk away with your soul unbent. Let them fear that. Let them sit in that discomfort. Because you never bowed. You walked with truth, and that alone made you unforgettable. You were the mirror they spent years avoiding. You weren't their enemy. You were their reflection. And that's what scared them the most, because you didn't just walk into their lives. You showed them who they really were, not with words, not with judgment, but with your truth, with your presence, with your unwavering refusal to pretend, and that made you a mirror. Not the flattering kind, not the one that filters or forgives. You were the kind of mirror that reveals the mess, the cracks, the contradictions. The kind of mirror people avoid when they're not ready to face themselves. And when you showed up, all their masks began to tremble. Not because you demanded truth, but because you embodied it. You see, they had worked hard to construct an identity, layer by layer, role by role. They had buried shame under charm. They had covered fear with control. They had wrapped insecurity in the illusion of power. And most people applauded it, believed it, even envied it, but not you. You looked at them and saw. You didn't flinch. You didn't flatter. You didn't fall for the illusion, and that terrified them, because when someone sees through you and doesn't run away, they become a mirror you can't ignore. You reminded them of the choices they didn't make, the healing they avoided, the masks they never questioned, and that made your presence feel like confrontation. Even when you said nothing at all, they called you difficult. Cold, intimidating, but deep down they knew what it really was, clarity. You didn't try to fix them. You didn't try to please them. You didn't even try to explain yourself, and that level of emotional independence. It was foreign, threatening, uncomfortable, because most people need others to validate their illusion. They survive by surrounding themselves with those who reinforce the image, not question it. And you were the exception. You didn't reflect back their ego. You reflected back their emptiness, and in doing so you became the truth they were running from. It wasn't personal. It was psychological. You reminded them of the work they hadn't done, the wounds they never acknowledged, the lies they told themselves just to get through the day. And when they looked at you, they couldn't escape it, not because you exposed them, but because they could no longer hide. You were the mirror that didn't crack under pressure, the one that didn't distort for comfort, and that's why they try to push you away, shrink you, silence you. Because when someone walks in holding a mirror, the room either gets honest or it gets hostile. But here's what they never understood. You never intended to make them uncomfortable. You just stopped making yourself small. You stopped pretending. You stopped apologizing for being the version of yourself that had risen from fire. And in doing so, you reminded them of who they could have been, had they chosen honesty over image. You didn't destroy them. You revealed them. You didn't attack them. You awakened them, and they weren't ready. So let them misunderstand you. Let them call you names. Let them avoid your gaze. That's not a reflection of your character. It's a reflection of what they see when you stand in front of them. You were the mirror they avoided because deep down they knew. You weren't broken, you were whole, and wholeness is terrifying to those who are still building themselves out of fragments and fiction. Stand firm in that. Stay true to that, because the real ones, the healed ones, won't fear your reflection. They'll recognize it, and they'll thank you for showing up as the kind of mirror that doesn't lie, doesn't flatter, and doesn't fold. You weren't meant to be easy. You were meant to be real, and in a world full of filters and facades, that alone makes you unforgettable.